The winter night was unusually cold as Officer Mike patrolled through Pine Grove Park, a place that had seen better days. The squeaking of rusty swings and whispers of wind through broken branches created an eerie atmosphere. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across graffiti-covered walls and scattered leaves. As he approached the old playground equipment, a small movement caught his eye. There, beneath a weathered slide, huddled a young boy no more than 12. The child wore only a thin jacket, his small frame shivering against the bitter cold. His dark eyes, wide with fear, met Officer Mike's concerned gaze. "Hey there, buddy," Officer Mike called out softly, crouching down to appear less intimidating. "It's pretty cold out here. Are you okay?" The boy pressed himself further into the shadows, clutching his backpack tightly. Officer Mike noticed the boy's worn-out sneakers, the holes in his jeans, and the way his shoulders trembled, not just from cold, but from fear. Drawing from his years of experience with scared kids, he sat down on a nearby bench, maintaining a safe distance. "I've got some hot chocolate in my car," he said, his voice gentle. "And I know a great little diner just around the corner. Makes the best cheese fries in town." He watched as curiosity flickered across the boy's face. After what felt like an eternity, the boy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not supposed to go with strangers." Officer Mike smiled warmly. "That's very smart of you. I'm Officer Mike from the 12th Precinct." He slowly reached for his badge, letting the boy examine it. "See? Now we're not strangers anymore." The boy's stomach growled loudly in the quiet night, and a faint blush colored his cheeks. Officer Mike pretended not to notice, instead sharing a story about his own childhood adventures in this very park, back when the slide was still shiny and new. Gradually, the boy began to relax. His shoulders dropped slightly, and he shifted forward into the light. Officer Mike could now see his face clearly. Young, but with eyes that held too much worry for someone his age. "What do you say we get out of this cold?" Officer Mike offered again. "No pressure, but those cheese fries are calling my name." He stood up slowly, extending his hand. The boy hesitated for a moment, looking between the officer's kind face and his outstretched hand. Finally, with small, cautious steps, he emerged from his hiding place. "I'm Chris," he said quietly, taking Officer Mike's hand. As they walked toward the patrol car, Officer Mike felt a mix of relief and concern. Something told him this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. "Would you like me to continue with part 2? The neon sign of Joey's Diner buzzed softly as Officer Mike held the door open for Chris. Warmth rushed over them as they stepped inside, and the smell of coffee and grilled cheese filled the air. The late-night crowd was thin. Just a few truck drivers and night shift workers scattered among the red vinyl booths. "Pick any spot you like, buddy," Officer Mike said, watching as Chris took in his surroundings. The boy chose a corner booth, where he could see both the entrance and the kitchen. Officer Mike noticed how his eyes darted around, always aware of the exits, a habit he'd seen in kids who'd learned to be too careful too young. Betty, the night shift waitress, who'd been serving at Joey's longer than Officer Mike had been alive, approached their table with a warm smile and 2 menus. Her eyes softened when she saw Chris's condition, but she didn't make a fuss. Instead, she pulled out her notepad and asked, "What can I get for you gentlemen tonight?" Chris stared at the menu, his fingers tracing the prices. Officer Mike could see the worry in his eyes, the kind that comes from knowing exactly how much things cost and not having enough to pay for them. "Order whatever you want," Officer Mike said gently. "I meant what I said about those cheese fries, but their chocolate milkshakes are pretty amazing too." He watched as Chris's eyes lit up at the word milkshake, though the boy tried to hide his excitement. Could I have both?" Chris asked quietly, as if expecting to be told no. When Officer Mike nodded, a small smile finally broke through the boy's careful facade. As they waited for their food, Officer Mike kept the conversation light, sharing funny stories about his job. like the time he had to help rescue a cat that got stuck in a Christmas tree. Slowly, between bites of fries and sips of milkshake, Chris began to open up. "My grandma's sick," he said suddenly, pushing a fry around in the ketchup. "She's in the hospital. Has been for 3 weeks now." His voice trembled slightly. "She's all I have." Officer Mike felt his heart tighten. "Is that why you were in the park?" Chris nodded, his shoulders hunching. "They said she had something called a stroke. I was scared they'd put me in foster care if they found out I was alone. Grandma always said we had to stay together." The boy's voice grew quieter. "I've been going to school like normal, so nobody would notice. I do my homework in the library until it closes. Then I—" He trailed off, looking down at his half-eaten fries. Betty appeared with a fresh plate of fries, setting them down without a word. She'd been watching, and somehow knew exactly when they were needed. Officer Mike caught her eye and nodded gratefully. "You're very brave," Officer Mike said carefully, "but you shouldn't have to handle this alone. I want to help, if you'll let me." Chris looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Will you help me find my grandma? Would you like me to continue with part 3? The fluorescent lights of Central Hospital hummed overhead as Officer Mike and Chris walked through the quiet corridors. It was nearly midnight, but Mike had pulled some strings with an old friend at the hospital to check on Chris's grandmother. The boy stayed close to Mike's side, his small hand clutching the officer's jacket sleeve. "Room 415, the night nurse whispered, pointing them down the hallway. She gave Chris a gentle smile, noting his nervous expression. "She's resting now, but you can go in quietly." Chris froze at the doorway when he saw his grandmother. She looked small in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and clear tubes. Her usually warm, round face seemed tired and drawn, but there was still strength in the way she breathed steadily, fighting to recover. "Grandma," Chris whispered, his voice catching. He took a tentative step forward, then another, until he was standing beside her bed. His hand hovered uncertainly over hers. "It's okay to touch her," Officer Mike encouraged softly. "She might be able to hear you too." Chris gently placed his hand over his grandmother's. "I'm sorry I couldn't visit sooner," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I wanted to, but I was scared they'd take me away. I've been doing my homework every day, just like you always tell me to. And I haven't forgotten to brush my teeth, even in the park." Officer Mike felt his throat tighten as he watched. He'd seen a lot in his 15 years on the force, but something about this scene, this brave little boy trying so hard to make his grandmother proud, even in the hardest circumstances, touched him deeply. A night nurse came in to check the monitors, and Officer Mike stepped into the hallway to speak with her. "How is she doing?" he asked quietly. The nurse, Linda according to her name tag, glanced at Chris through the door window. "She's stable, but recovery will take time. The stroke was severe." She hesitated, then added, "We've been worried about her. She kept trying to tell us something, but couldn't get the words out. Now we know she was trying to tell us about him." Back in the room, Chris had pulled a crumpled paper from his backpack. "Look, Grandma, I got an A on my math test last week," he said, carefully smoothing out the wrinkles and placing it on her bedside table. "Remember how you always said I could be good at anything if I tried hard enough?" Officer Mike watched as Chris continued talking to his grandmother, telling her about everything she'd missed. The boy's voice grew stronger with each word, as if finally sharing his burden made it lighter. Suddenly, there was a slight movement. The grandmother's fingers twitched, then slowly curled around Chris's hand. Her eyes remained closed, but Chris's face lit up with more joy than Mike had seen all night. "She squeezed my hand," Chris exclaimed in an excited whisper. "Did you see that? She knows I'm here." Officer Mike smiled, but his mind was already working through next steps. They couldn't leave Chris alone again, that was certain. But as he watched the boy lean closer to his grandmother, whispering promises to be good and study hard, Mike felt something stirring in his memory. Something about the way Chris's eyes crinkled when he smiled. Something hauntingly familiar. Would you like me to continue with part 4? The next morning, Officer Mike sat at his desk in the precinct, surrounded by open files and old photographs. He couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something about Chris, something important. His coffee had gone cold hours ago as he dug through records, making calls, and piecing together a puzzle he didn't even know existed until now. Chris was safely settled in the break room, wrapped in a borrowed police department sweatshirt that hung down to his knees, munching on donuts that Officer Jenny from the front desk had brought him. Every now and then, Mike would glance through his office window to check on him, watching as different officers stopped by to chat with the boy, sharing stories and making him laugh. "Hey, could you pull up something for me?" Mike asked Tom, the department's records keeper. "Remember Officer David, the one we lost 5 years ago? I need his personal file." As Tom pulled up the records on his computer, Mike's heart began to race. There it was. Officer David's photo stared back at him from the screen. Those same eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the same determined set of the jaw. Just like Chris. "Tom." Mike's voice was barely a whisper. "Did you know David had a child?" Tom shook his head. "Not that I ever heard. He was pretty private about his personal life, especially after his wife passed." Mike scrolled through the file, his hands shaking slightly. There it was. A death certificate for David's wife, dated 12 years ago. But buried deeper in the file was something else. A marriage certificate from a year before that, to a woman named Grace Thompson. The same last name as Chris's grandmother. Mike leaned back in his chair, the weight of this discovery hitting him hard. His former partner, one of the best officers he'd ever known, had a son he never knew about. A son who was now sleeping on a worn-out couch in the break room, who had been living in a park because he had nowhere else to go. He remembered the day they lost David. A routine traffic stop gone wrong. David had pushed Mike out of the way of a speeding car, saving his life, but losing his own in the process. His last words echoed in Mike's mind. "Always got your back, partner." Mike walked to the break room, his legs feeling unsteady. Chris was drawing something with crayons Officer Jenny had given him, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration, just like David used to do when filling out reports. "Hey, buddy," Mike said softly, sitting down beside him. "Can we talk for a minute?" Chris looked up, pushing his drawing aside. It was a picture of him and his grandmother standing in front of what looked like a house. "Is my grandma okay?" he asked immediately, worry creasing his young forehead. "She's fine," Mike assured him quickly. "I actually wanted to talk to you about your dad. Did your grandma ever tell you anything about him?" Chris shook his head. "Just that he was a good man who helped people. She has an old picture of him in her wallet, but it's kind of faded. She said he died being a hero." Mike took a deep breath, pulling out an old photograph from his pocket. In it, 2 officers stood smiling in front of a patrol car, himself and David, arms thrown over each other's shoulders, both much younger and more carefree. "Chris," Mike said gently, "I think I knew your father. In fact, I knew him very well. Would you like me to continue with part 5? Chris stared at the photograph in disbelief, his small fingers tracing the outline of his father's face. The break room suddenly felt very quiet, despite the usual bustle of the police station outside. Officer Mike watched as emotions flashed across the boy's face. Confusion, wonder, and something that looked like hope. That's my dad." Chris's voice trembled. He pulled out a worn wallet from his backpack, his grandmother's wallet, which he'd been keeping safe. Inside was a faded photograph, creased and worn from years of being carried. Though weathered, it showed the same man, wearing the same proud smile. "He was my partner," Mike explained gently, his own voice thick with emotion. "One of the best officers I ever knew. We worked together for 6 years." He paused, watching Chris compare the two photographs. "He saved my life, you know." Chris looked up sharply, his eyes wide. "Grandma said he died being a hero. Was that when?" Mike nodded slowly. "It was a regular day, just like any other. We were doing a traffic stop. That's when we pull over cars that might be breaking the law. Everything seemed normal until—" He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Your dad noticed something I didn't. He pushed me out of the way of a speeding car. He saved my life, but he couldn't save his own." Tears welled up in Chris's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. Instead, he sat up straighter, just like his father used to do when facing difficult situations. "Did he know about me?" "No, buddy, he didn't," Mike said softly. "And that breaks my heart because I know he would have loved you so much. Your dad was always helping people, always looking out for others, just like you've been doing for your grandmother." A small smile tugged at Chris's lips. "Really?" "Really," Mike confirmed. "You know what else? You scrunch up your nose when you're thinking hard, exactly like he used to do. And that determined look you get. Pure David." Officer Jenny appeared at the door with fresh hot chocolate, pretending not to notice as both Mike and Chris quickly wiped their eyes. She set down the cups and squeezed Chris's shoulder gently before leaving them alone again. "The last thing your dad said to me," Mike continued, wrapping his hands around the warm cup, "was that he'd always have my back. We were partners, and that meant something special. Now, finding you here, learning who you are, I think maybe he's still keeping that promise, in a way." Chris looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Well," Mike said, sitting forward in his chair, "I've been thinking. Your grandmother needs time to recover, and you need a safe place to stay. I made a promise to your dad to always have his back, and that promise extends to you now. If you're okay with it, I'd like to apply to be your temporary guardian. You could stay with me until your grandmother gets better." The boy's eyes grew wide. You'd do that, but you barely know me." Mike smiled softly. "I know enough. I know you're brave and smart. I know you've been taking care of yourself and trying to make your grandmother proud. And I know that you're your father's son, which means your family, even if we just found each other. Would you like me to continue with part 6? The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Officer Mike's modest 2-bedroom apartment, which had been a bachelor's sanctuary for years, was quickly transforming. The spare room, once filled with boxes of old case files and exercise equipment, now held a real bed, a desk for homework, and even a few posters of Krista's favorite superhero movies. "You really didn't have to do all this," Chris said, standing in the doorway of what was now his room. He clutched his backpack, still his only possession, tightly against his chest, as if afraid this might all disappear. "Every kid needs their own space," Mike replied, watching as Chris cautiously stepped into the room. "Plus, I needed an excuse to finally clean out all those old files." The social worker had visited earlier that day, inspecting the apartment and asking countless questions. Mike had answered each one patiently, showing her his steady income, clean record, and the support network he had at the police department. The temporary guardianship paperwork was already being processed. Later that evening, they sat at the kitchen table, sharing a home-cooked meal. Well, semi-home cooked, if you counted reheating lasagna that Officer Jenny had brought over. Chris had been quiet, pushing his food around his plate. "What's on your mind, buddy?" Mike asked gently. Chris looked up, his fork pausing mid-motion. "Can we visit Grandma tomorrow?" "Of course we can. In fact, I talked to her doctors today. They said she's showing real improvement. She's even started speaking a few words." The boy's face lit up. "Really? What did she say?" Mike smiled. "She asked about you. The nurses told her you're safe, and that seemed to help her relax. They think knowing you're okay is helping her focus on getting better." Chris nodded, finally taking a real bite of his dinner. After a few moments, he spoke again. "Officer Mike." "Just Mike is fine when we're home," Mike reminded him gently. "Mike," Chris corrected himself, "can you tell me more about my dad? Like, what was he like at work?" Mike leaned back in his chair, memories flooding back. "Well, your dad had this thing about always bringing extra coffee for everyone on the morning shift. He said you never knew when someone might need a pick-me-up, and he could make anyone laugh, even on the tough days." As they cleared the dishes together, Mike continued sharing stories. About the time David had helped talk down a scared teenager from a dangerous situation. About how he organized a Christmas toy drive for kids in the neighborhood. About the little things, his terrible jokes, his habit of humming while doing paperwork, his uncanny ability to know exactly when someone needed cheering up. "You know what's funny?" Mike said, handing Chris a plate to dry. "He always wanted to fix up that old park where I found you. Said every kid deserved a safe place to play." Chris's hands stilled on the dish towel. Could we maybe do that? Fix up the park, I mean, for him." Mike looked at the boy. This brave, thoughtful child who'd been through so much, but still thought out helping others. Just like his father. "You know what? I think that's a fantastic idea. We could talk to the department about organizing a community project. Maybe get some local businesses involved." Chris smiled, a real full smile that reached his eyes. "And maybe we could put up a plaque, telling people about Dad." "I think he'd like that," Mike said softly, reaching out to ruffle Chris's hair. "Though I have a feeling he'd be even prouder of you just as you are." Would you like me to continue with part 7? Spring arrived with new beginnings. At Central Hospital, Chris's grandmother was sitting up in bed, her voice growing stronger each day. The room, once stark and clinical, was now filled with Chris's drawings, cards from police officers, and fresh flowers that Mike brought every week. And then, Chris was saying excitedly, perched on the edge of his grandmother's bed, "My whole class volunteered to help with the park project. Even Mr. Wilson, my math teacher, said he'd bring his tools." His grandmother smiled, reaching out to hold his hand. Her movements were still slow, but the doctors were amazed by her progress. "You're doing good work," she managed, each word careful but clear. Mike stood in the doorway, watching the scene with a warm heart. The past few months had brought changes he'd never expected. His apartment now had superhero magnets on the fridge, homework spread across the kitchen table, and the sounds of morning cartoons replacing his usual quiet coffee routine. "Mike," Chris called out, noticing him, "can we show Grandma the plans?" Mike pulled out the rolled-up drawings from his bag, sketches for the park renovation project that had taken on a life of its own. What started as a simple idea had grown into a community-wide effort. Local businesses had donated supplies, fellow officers had volunteered their time, and even the mayor had gotten involved after hearing the story. "Look, Grandma," Chris explained, pointing to different areas of the design. "There's going to be new swings and a basketball court, and here." His finger traced a special corner of the park. "We're making a memorial garden for Dad." His grandmother's eyes filled with tears, but her smile never wavered. She looked at Mike, conveying with her gaze what she couldn't yet say in words. "Thank you for taking care of our boy." Later that evening, as they drove home, Chris was unusually quiet. Mike glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Everything okay, buddy?" Chris nodded slowly. "I was just thinking, when Grandma gets better, will I have to leave?" Mike pulled the car over, turning to face Chris properly. "Hey, look at me for a second. Your grandmother and I have already talked about this. Well, she wrote most of it, but we figured it out." He smiled reassuringly. "When she's ready to come home, we're going to help her get set up in the ground floor apartment in my building. The one right below ours, remember. That way, you can be close to both of us." Relief flooded Chris's face. "Really? We can stay together?" "Really. In fact, your grandmother was pretty insistent about it. Said something about me needing someone to keep me in line. Mike winked, starting the car again. Plus, who else is going to help me coach the Little League team I'm thinking about starting in the new park? Chris's eyes lit up. You're going to coach Little League. Can I help? Help. Buddy, I'm counting on you. I don't know the first thing about baseball. But I figure, between the two of us, we can learn together. As they drove through the evening streets, Chris started chattering about baseball statistics he'd been reading about at the library. Mike listened, throwing in the occasional question, marveling at how this child, his partner's son, now somehow his own, had filled a void in his life he hadn't even known was there. They passed by the park, where construction equipment stood ready for tomorrow's work. The old, broken slide where they'd first met was already gone, making way for something new, something better. Would you like me to continue with Part 8? The morning of the park's grand reopening dawned bright and clear. The newly painted benches gleamed in the sunlight, and colorful balloons danced in the breeze. Chris stood at the entrance, proudly wearing his junior volunteer t-shirt, directing people to the registration table where his grandmother, now well enough to sit for short periods, was greeting visitors with a warm smile. Mike adjusted his uniform, watching as more and more people arrived. The whole community had turned out, families with children, local business owners, fellow officers, and even Chris's entire class. The old park, once a symbol of neglect, had become something that brought everyone together. Officer Mike, Chris called out excitedly, running over. The news people are here. Should I show them the memorial garden first? The memorial garden was Chris's special project. He'd spent weeks researching plants that would bloom in different seasons, ensuring there would always be color and life in the space dedicated to his father. A simple bronze plaque stood in the center, telling the story of Officer David and his sacrifice. Lead the way, buddy, Mike smiled, straightening Chris's collar. Just like we practiced. As they walked toward the garden, Mike noticed how confidently Chris carried himself now. Gone was the scared boy from the park. In his place stood a child who knew he was loved and supported. The local news reporter knelt down to Chris's level as he explained the garden's features. These blue flowers are called forget-me-nots, he said, pointing to a cluster of delicate blooms. And over here, we planted Dad's favorite tree. Officer Mike told me he used to say every good park needs a climbing tree. Mike's chest tightened with pride as he watched Chris handle the interview like a pro. The boy had memorized the names of every plant, the story behind each design choice, and most importantly, he spoke about his father as if he always known him, through the stories, memories, and love that surrounded him now. After the interview, the mayor called everyone together for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Chris's grandmother was wheeled to the front, where Chris stood between her and Mike, holding both their hands. This park, the mayor announced, represents more than just new playground equipment and fresh paint. It represents how a community can come together, how love can grow in unexpected places, and how one small act of kindness can change lives forever. As the ribbon was cut, cheers erupted from the crowd. Children rushed toward the new playground, their laughter filling the air. But Chris stayed back for a moment, looking up at Mike. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" he asked softly. Mike knelt down, putting his hands on Chris's shoulders. "Buddy, he'd be more than proud. You've helped create something special here, something that will help other kids for years to come." Chris's grandmother reached out, taking both their hands. Her voice, growing stronger each day, added, "Just like your father, always thinking of others." The three of them stood together, watching as families explored the new park. The basketball court echoed with the sound of bouncing balls. The swings soared high against the blue sky, and in the memorial garden, butterflies danced among the flowers. Would you like me to continue with the final part, Part 9? 1 year later, the park buzzed with activity on a warm summer evening. The Little League team, wearing bright blue uniforms with Officer David Memorial League printed on the back, was having their championship game. Mike stood at the coach's box, watching as Chris stepped up to bat. The park had become the heart of the community. The memorial garden bloomed beautifully, tended regularly by Chris and his grandmother, who now walked with just a slight limp and volunteered at the community center they'd built next to the playground. Every morning, she'd sit on her special bench, watching children play while sharing stories with other parents. "Keep your eye on the ball, buddy," Mike called out encouragingly. Chris nodded, his face set in concentration, that same focused look his father used to have. The pitch came in, and with a solid crack, the ball soared into the outfield. The crowd erupted in cheers as Chris ran the bases. His grandmother stood up from her seat in the bleachers, clapping and smiling. Several off-duty officers who'd come to watch the game whistled and shouted encouragement. After the game ended, their team won by 1 run. Families gathered for the traditional post-game picnic. Kids played on the playground equipment that still looked as good as new, thanks to the community's dedication to maintaining it. The memorial garden glowed in the evening light, fairy lights twinkling among the branches. Mike found Chris sitting on the old bench near his father's plaque, still in his baseball uniform, sharing a sandwich with his grandmother. He sat down beside them, pulling out an envelope from his jacket. "Got something to show you both," he said, his voice gentle but excited. The adoption papers came through today. Chris's eyes widened, and his grandmother squeezed his hand. They'd talked about this for months, making sure everyone was comfortable with the idea. Chris would officially be Mike's son, while maintaining his special connection with his grandmother and his father's memory. "Really?" Chris whispered, looking between Mike and his grandmother. "It's really official." "Really official," Mike confirmed, showing them the papers. "But only if you're still sure about this, buddy." Chris launched himself into Mike's arms, nearly knocking over the sandwich. "I'm sure. I've been sure forever." His grandmother wiped happy tears from her eyes. "Your father would be so happy," she said, her voice clear and strong now. "Both of your fathers." Later that evening, as the sun set over the park, Chris stood between the two people who had become his unique but perfect family. The playground where he'd once hidden in fear was now filled with laughter and joy. The broken slide had been replaced by new equipment that would last for generations. "You know what?" Chris said thoughtfully, looking up at the darkening sky. "I think Dad led you to find me that night. He was still looking out for all of us." Mike pulled him close, watching as the first stars appeared above them. "I think you're right, buddy. He always did have our backs." As they walked home together, grandmother to her ground floor apartment and Mike and Chris to their place upstairs, they passed a park entrance sign. It read, "Officer David Memorial Park, where hope grows." Below it, someone had chalked a simple message: "Thank you for making our community better." Chris smiled, knowing that this park, once a place of loneliness, had become a symbol of how life could change in wonderful, unexpected ways. He had found not just a home, but a family, a community, and a way to keep his father's memory alive through helping others. And somewhere, he was sure, his father was smiling too. Would you like me to wrap up the story or add any additional details to this final part?